Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Marissa. And thank you to the Games Institute for bringing us here, allowing us the opportunity to share my work, to share our work, to be able to meet. And yesterday, being able to do the workshop on the intersection of menstruation and technology was a lot of fun, and we'll look forward to doing, I think, more in the future. Before I get started, I make it part of my practice to also acknowledge where I live and work, because it's not here, other than virtually. And my work takes place on the ancestral and traditional indigenous territories of the Blackfoot in Alberta and the people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And the Tsuut'ina Nation is a literal neighbor both to my home and to Mount Royal University. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share with you, but also revisit some work that culminated with my dissertation, which I defended in 2015, and that became a part of the work within the Q Lab. And it's like with any other kind of work, it was really interesting for me to have done it, to have set it aside as feeling finished to some degree, and then being able to, because of spending this time, knowing that I would spend this time with you, being able to look at it again with some fresh eyes and think about it and reinvigorate it into another layer of iteration. And I look forward to doing that. And I'll start off today sharing with you a bit where this work comes from. So about a third of the talk will be setting it up, because I think that part is important to my story, how I became the researcher, the design researcher that does this kind of work, and why that happened, and why it has become something that not only is work for me now and practice. I also have a small design agency, so I do interactive work for clients, but also in several ways has become part of my identity. And my identity as a designer has always been there, but that identity as an intersectional feminist designer is something that is a newly claimed territory for me, and one that I embrace hold very dearly to my heart at the moment. We spent, and by we I really mean Stan and I have about 18 years of doing design work together, of collaborating on projects. Jennifer and I have probably almost a decade now of working together, and doing a lot of work in particular for me within interface design, app design, website design, for scholars, humanities scholars, to do humanities research. A lot of the work dealt with large text collections and the research that could be done with text, and primarily within the spirit of trying to diversify the territory of what is possible within that space. So understanding what has been done, understanding what is being done, but then rather than iterating a bit at a time, attempting to extend what is possible. And back in 2015, Stan and I developed a diagram to try to explain what we found at that point. I would say 24 projects. Collaborative projects, interdisciplinary projects, so again, humanities scholars, a lot of them, computing scientists, engineers, and then disciplines within the sciences. So we worked with doctors, with folks who are trying to preserve provincial parks. So librarians, language scholars of all kinds. What we found to be the process as we were trying to introduce this idea of experimental or non-iterative change, extreme change. And we noticed that even though we were working on collaborative teams, that the same kind of process was happening over and over again. So someone would come to us with the idea that they wanted a really interesting, useful interface. And so we had a starting point, right? There was always some kind of a starting point for the most part. It might have been an Excel spreadsheet that was a starting point. It might have been a book with a whole bunch of sticky notes in it. Thank you. Might have been sticky notes, but there was some kind of a starting point. And really for us, the idea was to diverge from that starting point as drastically as possible. So if you sort of think of it of starting point as A, whatever that might be, we wanted to get to Z, right? And we proposed that. Right? Usually that was part of the conversation. Not always was part of the conversation, not usually, right? That's what we would offer because we were design researchers interested in that territory. Every time that we proposed to our teams Z, which was sort of the extreme departure, they didn't like it, to say it sort of very mildly. And for lots of different reasons, right? What it all boiled down to was, that's too much, and what are you thinking? That can't be a cog or a fern. Please stop doing these crazy things and just design us an interface. So we would go away and we would propose a small departure, what I call A+1. Right? So that's an iteration. It's whatever is the starting point, right? I have two degrees, sort of formal degrees in visual communication design. So I know which typeface to choose. I know how to insert white space. I know sort of what color palettes kind of go together. So all that kind of stuff. So we would apply those kinds of skills to the starting point, and we would give it back to our team and say, what do you think of this? Okay. This part of the process would take a lot longer, right? So usually that would be months. So while the first reaction was immediate, usually at the first meeting, and quite noticeable, the second reaction took a while. So I usually took it away, thought about it some more. There were meetings without us, there were meetings with us, and they would come back every time and say, well, we didn't mean that. That's boring and uninteresting, and really, we were kind of hoping you would do something different. And what we would land on, again, every single time, was somewhere in between the starting point and that extreme position, which, we call B. So not really terrifically upsetting to the territory, but clearly a new design, not sort of a stepwise iteration. I would say 24 projects across disciplines where we saw this take place. So having learned that, having experienced that, I started my PhD at the University of Alberta, and I was funded by a company that works in Alberta oil sands, because they had money, and they were willing to fund a designer to, as they said, imagine interfaces of the kind that we should expect 20 years in the future. So that sounded really exciting, super exciting. 20 years, that is great. I mean, Z, we love Z, we want to do Z, no one ever lets us do Z. This could be our opportunity. What do you think happened? It went exactly the same way. So here you have some starting points. So A, I'm just showing little slivers because you don't need to see all of that. There's a famous book on HMIs, so human-machine interfaces, that is a design book that has a set of guidelines of how these kinds of interfaces should be designed. So that's what the top image is. Imagine gray, white, black, some diagrams that look like pipes, so processes, and a lot of bar graphs. And also our, in this guy, partner client used a lot of Excel spreadsheets. So we had that as a starting point. We proposed Z, which was, imagine sort of mega scale, it should be on a big screen, there was a circle involved, there were cogs, and the cogs would react to each other, and if you change this cog, then these would sort of, do things and show you the impact of your decision. The whole thing, by the way, was about aiding managers in making better decisions around production in oil sands. Okay? So all of that, there's a calendar right on the outside, so you could also navigate through time. Okay. Yeah, they hated it, everything about it. We came back and presented them with design A+1, which was a better structured, essentially better structured diagram of the one of the top left. It showed in a visual form and allowed you visually to manipulate how much, what the bounds were of acceptable range for each of the measures. There was a solve button, because that was very important, and you would press it and something, blah, 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 and then you would get a bar graph that was the ideal solution to this particular production problem. That one they had for a year. So there was a lot of thinking involved around that one, which was really, really great, we think. They came back and said, not that one, very boring, not what we want. And eventually, we landed on something that had curves instead of bars. One of the things that the team debated for a year over is how much specific values, right, to how many decimal points, how important that was to everybody. And eventually they landed on the fact that that was actually not important at all, because what they wanted was to see relationships and change. So we started with this much production. They wanted to see the starting point and how much it would increase. That's what was important, not the specific values. So here's another type of visualization for us of what that process looked like. Right? What is important here for me is what this territory, right? Because this territory has become, or defines, this boundary defines still expected space. So even though the designs that I just showed you were unexpected to the folks we were working with, they were still using or borrowing familiar language. And in fact, what we discovered was that it was the familiar language that was tweaked, that was changed, that a lot of the time was the problem. You can't, oh my goodness, you can't use cogs this way. That's not how that works. Right? This is the right sort of visual language, but the wrong metaphor. And really, you're just being too playful with things that we take very seriously. So all of that space is still expected space. Some of the questions that we were asking ourselves as we were doing this work is who and what defines that acceptable territory? If you've done any design work, I don't know if there's any designers here, but this is standard practice for designers, is to try to understand where the boundary lies. So if I am designing a website for University of Waterloo, one of the things that I think about right at the beginning is, what do university websites tend to look like? What kinds are there? Is there a difference between Ontario universities and Alberta universities? Is there a difference between universities of this scale versus smaller ones, bigger ones? What did the past University of Waterloo websites look like? What do the government of Ontario websites look like if they're the ones funding this institution? Where does the institution want to go, right? But the institution itself is the point. So imagine the point that holds all of those departure points. And it's that defines sort of the space that ends up being a reference point for the design. The question that we don't often ask ourselves as designers is who has defined that territory, right? So we know, this is pretty easy to find out, who and what defines the territory that you're looking at, okay? But it's harder to discover who has defined the territory one way, right? How did all of this come to be? Who made those decisions? What is kind of ideas, cultural, social ideas, political ideas, did those decisions and those designs come out of? What kind of politic do they hold? What kind of culture do they hold? Based on the lineage of how it came to be this way. So that's really a question around what's outside that typical boundary. It's about understanding the boundary and then asking questions of what sits outside of it. We are really, really interested in that space. One of the things that was really exciting for me, I would say for us, about the oil sands project is that both of us don't have much experience. Okay, I will speak for myself. I don't have any experience in engineering at all. I think Stan has some. And definitely nothing to do with oil. If you asked my political stance on oil production, it's complicated, right? And I definitely never wanted to be funded by an oil company. So what was exciting for me was the idea that I could bring into that space some knowledge, some questions, some ways of investigating that territory from the humanities, which was where I just spent a decade. If I think about the questions that I was asking of digital scholars, the leap from that space into the space of designing interfaces for oil production was noticeable but not shocking. So that's right. That's kind of how I got where I got. We had this space that is around visualization for decision support, decision making, and making the calculations that drive those kinds of systems. We have the culture of the oil sands and oil sands production, and then added to that, I put some digital humanities visualization. But wait, what's this? What happens when you start looking at a territory that isn't easily, at least kind of partnered with your starting point? What happens when you look at something that really, in lots of ways, feels like it sits way out in the outfield, right? And you start looking at your problem through the lens offered by that territory, rather than the ones closely associated to your working space. So that's how I ended up with feminism. Because I really honestly couldn't think of anything, for me, more unlike the oil sands and unlike our team than Beyonce. Even before the famous VMAs moment. And if I think about oil sands, can you think of oil sands and Beyonce? The two don't naturally seem like they partner up. And to be completely transparent, by that point I probably was a little pissy. So the idea that feminism would sort of percolate in my mind and go, I wonder what would happen to decision support systems if you looked at them from a feminist perspective, seems like the kind of thing that would occur to me. And then the second piece, because I have again, spent 10 years doing large text visualizations, and 10 years before then doing client work. So design that is, the purpose of which is to solve problems, was really my space. And I encountered this crazy thing called speculative design, or design fiction, or critical design, which has some really great criticisms of it now by wonderful feminists. But at the time I thought, wonderful, so we have something that really I wouldn't associate with oil sands, and I have something now in my hands that I don't really associate with problem solving towards sort of a client goal or a stakeholder's goal. Let's see what happens when those things are put together. So if you're interested in speculative design, of course, Dune and Rabi. This is the Faraway chair from 1995. I will tell you very briefly what it's about, just in case you don't know. But it's a speculative project with the idea that you could enter this table, this box, and escape the various wavelengths, like the cell phone towers and electricity, various things, telephone things, right? So all those signals, you could escape from that, get a break from it by being in this enclosed space. Side note, very much like the, oh my goodness, now it's going to escape me. The thing, you go into the water and then you floating pools. Have you? Yeah, with all the salt. With the minerals. Yeah. With the minerals and stuff, and then they block out all of your senses. And then the deprivation floating chamber, float life. That's what it is called in Alberta, float life. I discovered it after I saw the Faraday chair, and it's quite a lovely experience. Side note. After working through the interfaces that I had designed for the oil sands partners, looking at my own work, looking at what was problematic in that work, if I looked through it through a sort of a multi-feminist lens and through critical design or speculative design, and questioning my own behavior as a designer while working on that project, that's where the first six principles of the space that could be occupied by feminism and HCI, that's where that came from. One of the big moments for me was right at the beginning of the project, our partner said, you know, ice cream production is just like oil production, so you should use ice cream production instead because it's exactly the same. The formulas are the same. You have the same set of sort of ingredients or factors at play. So really just use ice cream. And that point, the problem with that statement really percolated for me at the very end of this entire process. I don't know if you had one of those moments where you sort of wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, how did I not see that? And that was exactly it for me. So I'd like to take you through the 6 and attempt to show you how I think they could look like, how they can manifest within design projects, design work of various kinds. So the first one really comes out of that idea of pushing against those edges, right? So challenging existing practices. Alan Gailey and Rooker have argued, the paper was Susan Liepert, I apologize, about how important it was to diversify the available pool of ideas, right? That if we have one set of, sort of think of a pool, and you only have in the pool what's in the pool, then you will only keep having the stuff in the pool that's in the pool, right? So there was an onus on design researchers, in this case, to try to extend what's in there, right? Make the pool bigger, put other things in the pool, the metaphor is falling apart. I'm thinking now rubber duckies floating in it, right? But fill it with things that then can inspire other directions, right? So this felt very real for me in the Oil Sands project. So I codified it, right, as a way to practice, as a way to say, we understand what this territory is, we will understand it, but our goal will be to see where it can go. And that design becomes the opportunity to increase the available vocabulary for others. So here's a project that we did right after I graduated. And this one is attempting to look at interface interactions or digital design of various kinds, but look at what would happen if we built a text analysis machine using physical materials rather than digital materials. So we took Stefan Sinclair's famous bubble lines interface, which is beautiful and wonderful, as it is. You should check it out. But we took that interface and reimagined it with a collaborative team as a physical object. It was meant to work essentially exactly the same, except that it's using plywood, some reclaimed water bottles, colored sand. We have some Arduinos, so we have the text analysis is still being run on a laptop, but then it's being fed into this display rather than the bubble lines display. We had an amplifier because one of the members on our team was an audio artist and musician. So he thought, I can hear something happening as the sand is falling into the tubes. This could be super cool. So he rigged it so that depending on what was happening with the interface, you got a slightly different sound. In the tubes, so each of the tubes would be one result. So imagine that you are looking for word frequency in a text, and you're looking for the word feminism. It would be sort of sand, regular sand, colored sand, until it hit the word feminism, and then it would give you red colored sand. So then by looking at the tube, you could see, if you sort of visualize that entire text being the tube, you could see where in the text and how often the word feminism occurs. Few things we learned from this. And the biggest one I mentioned yesterday in the workshop, the biggest one for me was how much joy I was able to observe from my colleagues in DH. We presented this at the National DH Conference. How much joy and animation happened when we wheeled this thing in front of the audience. And we had to have a tarp. It was very heavy. It was messy. Then we turned it on, and it sounded like a dying cow being milked. It's probably the closest kind of sickly cow. Very sickly. So that entire experience, right, the mess, the fact that you had these tubes, you know, folks became excited about capping them off. They said, can we take one? Can we take it out? Can I put it on my wall? Can we do another text? Why that sound versus some other sound? Right? It was actually just amplification of the sand passing. It wasn't anything outside of, metaphorically, the text itself that was creating the sound. Right? But the object brought so much joy from everyone. There was giggling. And I don't think I've seen them giggle, ever. It was lovely. So having that experience of building this, there's a second piece to that about joy. So you can see that joy is my favorite part about this project. Because I rented out a motorcycle shop a feminist motorcycle shop, downtown Calgary, and we had we had about 10 participants from various, they were essentially some colleagues, some students, and some of my friends who came in, and we did this together. But the motorcycle shop was still running as a motorcycle shop, so folks kept coming into the shop and encountering these people doing this thing. Not only I really knew anything about digital humanities and text analysis. All of the other participants had just literally learned about it. And watching the visitors and these folks who are building this thing become animated and excited about explaining text analysis and digital humanities to one another around this object was pretty priceless. It became this sort of community meeting point. So challenging existing practices. I've designed dozens and dozens of interfaces just on my computer. Right? I stopped sketching a couple years before that because I know how to design these things, and I usually even skip that part these days. Right? Completely removed myself from the physical space, and then forcing myself back in the most physical way that I could think of to see what would happen, right? How this very different space, how it would influence what happens at the interface level. Next one is aiming towards an actionable ideal future. So one of the criticisms that I love speculative design. It's wonderful. It's just not necessarily for me as it typically occurs. So that's what I mean by that. One of the ways that I wouldn't be able to work in that space all the time is that I'm a bit of an idealist, and I want even the things that we often create are experimental. You know, some of them are implemented, some of them are not. The idea is that they could happen. The idea is that they still could have a purpose. They could make a difference, some kind of a positive change in the world. So within here, the thought became very important to have design that is meant to enact some positive change in the world. Right? That wasn't designed for design's sake. That yes, it was supposed to diversify ideas, but still it was meaning to positively move something forward. And one of those examples, this is a project management platform that was designed by Zinyi under Stan's oversight, I believe. Jennifer, and yours, yes? So this interface, the starting point in this project management platform are the stakeholders, are the people who are part of the team rather than the tasks. So who are the people, and what do they need? What are their goals? Why are they on this project? Why do they have this job? Right? As I've heard Stan say, I was working on this project as an intellectual contributor, but I was not a part of the design team. But I heard him say, you know, if Ali really is on this project, is participating in it because she just wants a motorcycle, that's a very legitimate goal. That's a very legitimate thing to be, that's a legitimate reason to be there. And is there some way that the team and working on that project can help Ali achieve that goal? If you have experiences on within project management platforms, that's a really different way of thinking about a project. Right? Not think about the company in this case, really. The client, somewhere in there. The tasks are somewhere, you know, those things are still there and they're important and they will happen. But what is being made to be the most important? What is primary, on top of, meant to be on top of mind? This one, this principle of actionable ideal future and looking for what is made invisible, Both of those came about when I realized that I have been designing this interface that was meant to support managers in making decisions about production using formulas appropriate for that task. Not anywhere in that entire object, nowhere, ever, anywhere were there people. Now, no workers, no hours worked, no acknowledgement of expertise. I'm sort of stretching here. There were just really no people. There was waste. We had a lot of waste. We had trucks, and we had parts of the production, but not people. So what looks for what is made invisible or underrepresented, right? No matter the object, no matter the interface, the collection, the task, there will be something that isn't present. And this principle is meant to ask that question. What is it? Why is it not there? Every time we have a collection of texts, it's a subset. It's a selection made by someone. Someone's decided that this will be our object of study, that this will be what we will design an interface for, or we will have access to. What sits outside of that? And then back to the question that I asked previously, who made that decision? What is that decision based on? If it's a legacy decision, where does it come from? Who has made that decision? So here's a project from a student group. So last year I had a bit of funding from my provost to run a material data project within my third-year information design class. And I asked them to physically represent a data set. They could choose what data set that would be, and to empower or provide opportunities that the visitors could add more data through what they've created. So in this case, this group decided to focus on menstrual shame or period shame. And they built, this thing is about, it's a little taller than me, if you can imagine that, so maybe what is that? 1.5 by 1.5 meters, beautifully constructed. I mentioned the troughs yesterday, but I don't think I pulled that thread enough. There's actually beautiful troughs here. So you see these ledges? They have things you clean dishes with. Sponges, thank you. They have sponges in them so that the liquid that will could be cast off these tampons would be caught, and it wouldn't create extra mess for the housekeeping staff that is employed at Mount Royal. You chose a color, and those were different kinds of experiences. Took a tampon, dipped it, and then hung it according to your experience of where that shame you thought came from. Society media, men, other women, myself. Few things really incredible about this project. One, they had to reset it 4 or 5 times. There were hundreds. I know the original set of tampons they made was 300, and they run through those, and they had to make more. It was never defaced. It was in a public spot where there was no one watching it. It was in a stairwell, very public stairwell. And it was in, like, people played with it. People used it. I watched it. I would pass by it every day because I was honestly, frankly, afraid that someone would be mean to my students. So I passed it every day, and I would stand back, and I would watch all kinds of folks come up, talk amongst themselves. Some would giggle, some would not, right? And they would engage with this object. So in this case, right, we have data, data becoming physical form or taking on a physical form. being gathered, being created, sort of co-created. The community is co-creating this data. But more so than that, it's also bringing into a physical space a subject matter, an object, the tampon, an object that has color on it, that's been used outside of its package, really, that we really don't encounter. Like, this is a very unusual thing to stumble upon, right, on all of those levels. And in this case, I would argue that this interactive data display was able to do some things that a digital one would have a hard time with, right, would not be able to meet. Automatically, you have a separation when something's on the screen. It's a representation rather than the thing itself hanging right beside you as you are passing in the hallway. And in the case, again, of tampons, that reality, that authenticity can be quite uncomfortable. The next principle comes out of asking questions and a sort of really lack of satisfaction with one level or layer of information. In part, it's based on this notion of close versus distant reading that is part of the digital humanities discourse. The idea that texts, there's great value at looking at texts, that it's within the context of the book, but the text itself, right? You have the words, you have your sentences, your paragraphs, right? And you have the totality of the text, whatever that might look like, whether it's little or it's big, right? But that interaction with the text at a close distance is very important, can be very important, very valuable, lead to certain discoveries. And that at a distant level, when texts or words or paragraphs are aggregated, perhaps abstracted, and then displayed and can be manipulated that way, that there's value, potential discovery there as well. So if Dr. Rooker has published first through his dissertation and then subsequently a lot of work on the rich prospect browsing that really well acknowledges, right, the need for different kinds of interactions, right? That it's important to be able to look at something up close, but it's also, there's some really great value at looking at things at a distance and see as almost like a landscape, right? See the entire thing play out in front of you. And I wanted to extend that to include this starting point, to include a middle ground, right? And that acknowledge that I believe there needs to be actually at least 3 levels. I'll say at least because God knows where this is going to go. But for now, I'm at 3. So micro, meso, and macro. And that meso layer, in my mind, really is the status quo. It's whatever is the most expected starting, like the most expected level of detail, right? And once you set that, seeing what happens when you get really, really, really close to the information and when you get really, really, really far, right? We've designed, so see if I can give you an example. I think this one, yes, I do have one. So this is design work by Sandra Gabriel. It's the Mandala browser. You can still see this online, yes, Stan? Is this still available?
There's a version of it in the current book.
Okay. It has, so this one is loaded Romeo and Juliet. And if you imagine, this is the interface state it's already being worked on. So this is not the starting, the initial state. But imagine that each one of these little dots, okay, is a speech from Romeo and Juliet. And does it start? I think it starts from enter to enter, right? Whatever the return point would be, is the length of text that it has.
Yeah, these are all from XML tag things. So
exactly.
You can see on the right there's one.
So here you could drag in these magnets. Think of them sort of as magnets, and you can load the magnets with their various attributes. So in this case, the blue magnet is Romeo. So the speech speaker is Romeo. And then we could see how many of the speeches congregate around Romeo. So how many of them are spoken by Romeo? In this case, the speaker is Mercutio. We have Juliet. We have anybody else? Nope, that's it. And then you can do combinations. So you can say, okay, what about if we have Juliet, and the speech mentions death. Okay, so here's all the speeches mentioning death. Which ones are spoken by Juliet and mention death? So this would be this is a beautiful example of that distance reading. Right? You can set up that territory and you can see this beautiful painting of what's happening based on your parameters. While at the same time, you can click on any of these and you can actually see the text. Right? So the object itself is still here. It's not lost. You're not asked to only interact with this material in an abstract. You can still access the text. So here, I think it's a beautiful example of both detail and prospect, right? Sort of view of the land, bird's eye view. But what would happen if any of those actually became the default? We acknowledged it as a starting point, and then we went up and down in either direction. How does that change what kind of information is shown? How much more information do we see? Right? What becomes revealed when there's 3 instead of 2? I was thinking, Darshana, I was thinking yesterday about the things that you and Bree created. And there are these beautiful paintings that contain biological material, right? So we look at them, and we can look at them as a set, right? So if there was 20 of them, we could lay them out, and we could stand back, and we could see some kind of pattern based on something, right? We would be able to do that. Then if we look at the individual paintings, we would be able to see color, texture, amount of material, right? Paint, whatever. There's one more, right? If that painting is the starting point and we zoom out, so imagine zooming out and looking at all of them and being able to see something. When we go inside of it, there is information inside of that material. And it's incredibly valuable, very interesting information. If we imagine if that was menstrual flow, right, how much beautiful biological information would be in each of those paintings? Because these principles emerge out of feminism, I believe very strongly that we need to, as designers need to make their positionality known, better known, more visible. Right? What is the position of what is the starting point, not just in the data, but what is the starting point of the person who is the creator? Who gathered the data? Where did that come from? Who designed with it? What were their constraints? What was their capacity? What were they looking at? What did that territory look like? What did they reference? Not in terms of blame. That's not the point. The point is to know what the boundaries are of that object, right? So that we don't continue to argue that the object is neutral. Right? That interface that I was designing for the oil sands is not neutral. No one can convince me of that. At this point, I don't think, well, you can try, okay. So that was not a very welcoming statement. I am yet to be convinced, is much nicer. I'm yet to be convinced that that is a neutral object. Just as I am yet to be convinced of any of the designs that I created to be neutral objects, right? That is not a position I hold. So if it is not neutral, then what is it? Right? Do we need to ask those questions? So what is the position of the design? What is the design trying to do? What is the perception of the design? What is the perception of the design upon its users or its imagined users? What is it supposed to think of its users? How it's supposed to treat them? And then, of course, what is the positionality of the designers themselves? We recently, and Stan will be getting into this project a lot more. I will be very brief today about our work on, all of our work on design for peace and reconciliation in Colombia. We helped to design and run a project in Tumaco, Colombia this past summer. And our work will continue with our partners there. And one of the things that we realized when we were in Tumaco is that the community had some very strong ideas around what they wanted from us once we left. So we had originally committed to doing public displays, public performances, right, once we came back. And since coming back, we've been really, we've had to ask ourselves, what does that look like? What should that look like if we are going to be responsive to the needs and the critiques of our partners who are there? So, being able to be transparent of why we were there was part of that. We committed to it, and I believe we executed it fairly well. But then being able to be accountable back to the community, being able to be agile enough and responsive enough to what they needed and what they wanted from us to be able to shift our own agendas. And then finally, right, which is part of that accountability, right? That accountability comes from conversation, comes from inviting rigorous critique, saying, please tell us. Right? Being able to say, we welcome conversation, we welcome to be challenged, we welcome to be wrong if that's what is taking place. And we will do our best to adjust. We will take the time to adjust, to think through our adjustments and what that needs to look like. This, now I'm having a hard time remembering what I said yesterday versus today, so I apologize. But really, my starting point very much for this is that I don't believe any design is ever finished. I resist that. I think that even when a design is out in the public, even when it's used by people, even when it becomes a thing on my phone that I paid money for, it is still an iteration. It still is a moment in time that can be changed, that can be wrong, or that can be right here now, but it can be wrong tomorrow, right? Whatever wrong means, right? Needing thought, needing consideration, evaluation, and change. Or being discarded, I guess, is one of the other options too, right? So what now? Mentioned it a few times. So here, if you're interested in the 11 principles that the Q Collaborative now holds, they are made public on our website. And I invite you very much to offer us feedback and critique on any of them, all of them. That's why they're there. We have had feedback. I was not part of that conversation. Jennifer might be a better person, Shanna would be a better person to ask than me. But we've had feedback in the past, and we sat together and we considered what was being asked of us, and whether we were holding to these values. One of those, for example, on the table for us, give me a sec. Community focused, I believe. Yes. I believe so. It probably touches on a few of them. Is we are committed to thinking through what it means to give back to the community, and what happens when we are asked of communities to take time out of their days, out of their livelihoods to engage with us. And we had a lot of that in Colombia, right? And we had the community participants who were there were supported by their communities, literally in terms of money, food, childcare. They were supported by their communities so that they could do the work with us while we were holding the workshops, right? And we want to think more through what our role is in that. Right? I've also started asking myself, the principles, I'm going to rewind a little bit. When looking at Feminist Hci, which I did not invent, if that wasn't clear earlier, and looked at the principles of Feminist Hci that are in the literature, and the responses back onto those principles, one of the questions that kept coming up again and again was, how much does it take to be feminist? Right? If you have 4 principles, 5, 11, 17, 73, is it a checklist? Does it mean that you need to, is it a majority? Is it 2/3? How do you become feminist? And I resist that as an idea, period, because that just feels like we should all have stars or ratings somehow of feministness, and that just feels really kind of uncomfortable to me. So I've been asking myself, what does that mean then? I've created these 6 principles. We now have 11, and someone comes up to me, how do you implement them? My one response to that, I have 3 responses here. My one response is that it's not about a checklist. It's about seeing if and how many of these things resonate with you, what kind of work you want to be doing, what kind of work can you do given the resources and your own positionality at this time and place, and do what you can, do what is possible for you. Once I start thinking about feminism and money, not democracy, the other one. Thank you. Capitalism. Once I think about the intersection of feminism and capitalism, I get really uncomfortable. It's like, I don't know how to destroy capitalism. It is a very big checkbox. And I tend to take jobs very seriously, so if someone signs me that job, I think I'm going to go hide somewhere. So, what does that look like? So the best I can come up with, if not the checkboxes, are these 2 lists. One's mine, one's Stan's. The first one, when you're working on a project, look for what makes you uncomfortable. And then ask yourself why. Don't automatically assume that the territory, that is the low-hanging fruit, that is the obvious, which literally I've taught to generations of designers, that I've been taught. You look at the territory that surrounds your object of study. Do that, of course do that, but also seek out what's outside of that. And in particular, the thing that feels like it's really different. What creates tension? What will help you ask interesting questions? Yesterday we were asking the question of what happens when you look at menstruation and technology. What happens? What happens when you flip the things that you use, the words, the attributes you assigned to menstruation and the attributes you assigned to technology, and what happens when you flip them? And all of a sudden, those attributes of menstruation are attributes for technology and vice versa. What happens? Spend time pushing against your own edges. Right? There's something that defines your knowing. Whether that's your discipline, it's a combination. It's your discipline, it's how you were educated, how you've lived, your generational inheritance, all of those things create you, and there's boundaries around that as well. What is that? What sits outside of it? What makes you uncomfortable outside of that? If you have an identity in that position or a starting point, what is it? Can we really push into something unfamiliar outside of our comfort zones? We don't know what that is. We don't know what our space is, the one that surrounds us. And then I asked Stan this question today. I said, okay, I want to give folks a list of things to think about if they want to practice Feminist Hci or feminist anything in terms of design. And I am fully crediting him on this one. Number one, recognize the ongoing suffering created by patriarchy even if you haven't caused or experienced it. I think that's fair. That's a pretty fair point. Recognize and acknowledge your own privilege and trust intersectional feminists. That last one is really difficult for me, personally. You've
taken out the word leadership.
I did. Okay, originally he had trust intersectional feminist leadership, and I started hyperventilating. Not because of feminist intersectionality, but because the idea that I would trust leadership is so disturbing to me that I just couldn't let it pass. Like I just couldn't. Even when it's like my club, like my club. Like, yeah, but the leaders, you don't know. You don't know. They could screw us all over. So, well, know thyself is really about one of or two of those. So that's me. One of the exercises we didn't get into yesterday that I think would be important, could be important here, or could be useful here, is thinking about gaze. So as I was writing these out, I was really conscious of, not with an answer by the way, but conscious of the fact that I don't know very many of you. I know a few of you a little tiny bit, and I knew a few of you quite well, and a few of you a little bit better, right? Somebody made me a milkshake about a year ago, it was delicious. But a lot of you I don't know, right? And these things really are very personal, right? What that looks like. There's a lot of my colleagues that for number 3, I would just say it without a question. I would just say, no, stop it, trust intersectional feminists. Stop it, just stop whatever you're doing and just do number 3. And then in some situations, that's one that would make me somewhat uncomfortable, right, where I have to take out leadership. But I will leave that for your reflection. To bring it together, one thing I want to make sure to clarify is that when I think about these ways of intersecting feminism and design HCI, whether it's interactive, digital, any other, I think of it as coming into play at several levels, not just one. One of those is in terms of looking at the things that are out there in the world. So interrogating the things that surround us, the things that we lift up, that we celebrate, the things that we ignore, right? The things that make a lot of money and the things that flop, right? But looking at our world of made objects, right? And thinking through them in terms of these principles. The second one is in the act of construction or in the process of making, thinking, remaking, thinking again. So within the maker process, those can be very useful. And then when we reflect on our own work, right? So we've made something and then we're looking back on it in an effort to learn something from that object to bring forward into the future. And even though for me this journey started off in human-machine interaction, HMIs, HCIs, then interface design, interactive design, at this point I don't have a boundary between the types of things, objects, artifacts that I believe could stand being interrogated in these ways. Everything from, again, objects, artifacts themselves, so designed things, to collections of things, to systems, to groups, thinking about how we define, so not, I want to make a distinction, not, okay, here's a group of people and now we're going to judge them in various ways, but how we have gathered in our minds as part of our process a group, how we have decided a group to be, and then to think through that. And the methods themselves, right? What methods, processes do we use, tools do we use to make these things? Thank you, and again, thank you for the Games Institute for bringing me all the way here. I really appreciate it. This was wonderful. This space, I am jealous, like you wouldn't believe, envious, much nicer. I am very envious of the space and of all of you, and I really hope that I get a chance to spend more time with you at some point. Come back and do that. And I do hope that if you feel so inclined, that you reach out to me on Twitter. We also have now a Q Collaborative Instagram account. So if you follow us on Instagram, you will see our projects as they unfold. This is the place where the next 1,000 photographs from Colombia will sit, rather than my own private Instagram account. I had complaints by my family. So thank you for that.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe it's unfair that I'm not any question given that we're comments were closely together. But so just to clarify that last slide, which was really, really interesting. Are you suggesting then that interrogation, construction, reflection is kind of an overarching approach that you can take, to get at any of these things? So you're kind of expanding the category of what can be taken up within this process of knowledge exploration.
Yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is that I don't see a reason why, if you wanted to think about something through any of the things I discussed today, any of the principles I discussed, or we have on the Q Lab, that you would only do that to a finished object, to a finished piece of design, or only do it while you are designing, right? Because I haven't come up with a reason why you would do that. I think there's value in looking at, so if you think about, I'll pick something fairly, we iPhone, right? Okay, so you pick an iPhone, and then you look at the iPhone through those categories, right? You would know something now about the iPhone, hopefully, after doing that exercise, even though you haven't designed it, that you didn't know before, and that I would hope will then inform your future work as a designer, right? Same thing if it is a piece of the work that you've made. So those principles, I had designed all of the interfaces for our partner, and then I discovered feminism, right? Then I started thinking about feminism. So, and it was actually really lovely that that happened. I feel that it was a really interesting experience because I had these things as I would have designed them before I started thinking about them through a feminist perspective. And then I did all of that work. I sort of interrogated that territory of feminism, whatever, right? And then I came back to my designs and I went, okay, now what? Now what do they tell me? What do I learn? What did I not see? Right? Now looking at them through that. Right? And one of those things, for example, was, oh my God, I can't believe that our partner literally told me, and I said yes to using ice cream. And that is what we did. Wow, that's problematic. Right? And then within the construction itself, so there, now that I design objects, as I make something, right? So I think about things, and then I make something, and then I stop, and then I look at the thing, and I think about it. One of the ways that I think about it used to be things like usability. It still is usability, but right. So is it useful? Is it usable? Usable for whom? Is it legible? Is it readable? Is it able to address various needs that have been identified? So I used to, and the aesthetic, so I used to look at an object very much through, is it a well put together object? Do things go together, group together the way that they should? Is it all screaming at me and yelling for my attention? So all of that stuff. And now I look at all those things, and now I also look at it through those principles. Is that an answer? Was that your question?
I think it helps, yeah.
Okay.
I was just trying to figure out the connection between the two columns.
This is more when, and this is more trying to extend that we could do this not just to an object. Right, just to an interface. I get just, an interface or a logo or a poster or a book, right? But also to the database that holds the collection that will then be feeding the interface. That object also can be interrogated. The code can be interrogated. The system that came up with the code probably could stand some interrogating. Does that make sense now? Okay.
So first of all, thank you again. I can't help but get the idea of the treatment of the user by the interface rather than just the inverse out of my head, and really kind of linking that to technological evolution and the ways in which not only do we train our technology, but technology trains us, and really bringing in the notion of recognizing privilege and how understanding privilege of even digital literacy can really affect the ways in which the interfaces affect a user. Where if we have grandparents who might not be as familiar with technologies, how that level of privilege as a designer can go into how the interface treats a user. I was kind of wondering what your thoughts in that connection were.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. I had a story. Carl van de Velde. Do you remember Carl van de Velde? No, Netherlands, I believe. I haven't seen him in probably 20 years, but is very well-known designer, design thinker, and usability researcher. And I got to, about 20 years ago almost, I got to pick him up from the airport. And I proceeded to watch this really lovely man. This is actually his story, by the way. We've talked about this, so I'm sharing it with you. I'm not. So I navigate the airport and the campus by essentially hitting himself on everything in his path. And then he brought that up in his talk. And he said, one of the things that makes me, I think, a really good designer is that the world baffles me. I am not good at navigating it. Everything is an obstacle. If there is a way to screw something up, I'm going to do it. And then that, I think, makes me a better designer because I don't have sort of this idea that there's this perfect way that people navigate the world, and then everybody else who doesn't navigate it this way, there's something wrong with them. Okay? And that was the first time I heard anyone say that. That was literally the first time. Because every other time when I heard someone talk about adjusting the environment for folks who were elderly or folks who had had different abilities, right? Strengths in one area, perhaps some disabilities or lack of strengths in another area. It was always a conversation around, oh, well, how can we adjust this perfect environment to make it work for them? And he just sort of threw me out of that space. And I went, wait, whoa. If this dude, who's like, I look at him, I'm like, oh, he's just great. He's just perfect. Like he's brilliant. Not like, yet he's hitting himself all the time, and it sucks for him to be here. And then I thought about how much it sucks for me to be here. And then how much it sucks for other people to be here. And then you hear folks talk about themselves, especially when it comes to, I think, age and technology, right? When they say, oh, I'm just too old to, oh, this is just, I just can't figure this out. Oh, I just can't. Well, is it really, right? No, it's not. Like, the thing is shit. It should really just not do that to someone. It would be really nice if it didn't. Think about, I still remember paying tuition. It was that recently. What does it feel like to have to navigate through the university system to pay your bloody tuition, right? And all the things that are attached to that. Fear and shame and loss, right? And anxiety over what's going to happen. Right? How many times, did I pay it late and then was afraid of punishment, knew it was coming, right? Is it a problem with me because I need therapy to better deal with paying my tuition? Well, I need therapy and I do have a therapist, but that's a side issue. I also don't really believe that system should be designed in a way that doesn't consider the fact that for many students, paying tuition is a really hard thing to do. So I would hope, this is my hope is that if we start sort of thinking about the objects we design and that are designed around us in lots of different ways, that we can see more of that. Right? And that not any of those will solve the problem, but that we sort of expand our own territories of what questions are being asked, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, what is tolerated, what creates different kinds of emotions, and whether that's really realistic, okay, and not, all of that. Did I answer that?
Perfect.
Okay. I love bringing out Carl because I just think he's such a super person for doing that.
We have time for one more if there's one more. So you go. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us more about ice cream. Because it strikes me as like a couple of things about the ice cream analogy are really attractive. So I can see, I think, why one might want to move from the extremely complex system of Tarsen's decision-making process to a model that feels more manageable in terms of scope and complexity.
Mhm.
So, and that might participate in, or might share a set of core, like, assumptions about, say, productivity, maybe, or efficiency. So I can see that why one might reach for that kind of analogy, especially for the purpose of the PhD project, where you look at the dancing down 4 years, and that's, and then you have to convocate, right? Defend it and convocate.
Yeah.
And I think that method of choosing a simpler analogy for a complex problem as a means of like a thought, like getting a thought experiment going, can be useful.
Yes.
But I'm also, it's like, you know, it makes me really uncomfortable for a whole bunch of reasons. And so what I'm wondering you could do for us is talk us through for you what that moment was when you went, oh my God, I created an ice cream thing.
Yeah.
What was that about for you in relation to the feminist principles?
For sure, and I will say, so I'll say a few things that were said to us that I think will clarify some of this. When the ice cream scenario was put on the table, one of our first questions actually was, that sounds like it would be far less complicated and complex than oil. And because you are actually asking us to create something that you will find useful in the future, that will be a problem. Because in design, really, we should be tackling something that is more complex, because then you can take away or you can pare down, rather than something that is simple or small, then scaling up is a bigger problem than scaling down. So we asked that question right off the bat and said, whoa, do. And we were told, and then told again, it is exactly the same. The same equations would be driving it, right? So we were dealing with the interface side, but at the same time, other PhD students in engineering were working on the equations that would generate the best decision scenario. So they were working on that. The idea was that they would give us that equation, and then our system would then generate, we could manipulate the parts of the equation using the system, and then it would generate the proper response using that equation. So it had to actually work in a way that it would respond to that equation. So that was the reason why this became such a big holy crap moment for me, was because they said it was the same. So then, and then we worked through it, because I designed, remember the cogs? Okay. So the cogs, imagine each cog, let's see, there were ice creams. So there were different designs of cogs depending on which ingredient in an ice cream you would have. So there were different cogs for each ingredient. And then there were different designed cogs for the formula of all of those ingredients, or some of those ingredients coming together. And then there was a design for what happened when the decision was made. So at every stage of that design, so the parts, think of them as sort of parts that make up something that's together, that then generates something else, right, so an answer. Each of those was then designed by me with ice cream, but that accurately represented how those parts and how many of those parts would be if it was oil. So after all of that, what was really left for me was this couldn't have been a decision on anything other than ice cream is more palpable than oil sands in Alberta, right? And you know, how do we not embarrass? How do we not create a problem for our partner while we talk about ice cream? We don't talk about what they actually manufacture.
It also, when you put it like that, it also, so it makes, it points out for me that the equation is the system. That is the given, right? That is the premise
Exactly.
of the whole thing.
Exactly.
And so they didn't even really want, in theory, this is a decision-making support for managers, right? In fact, what it is a decision removal engine. It's a decision removal algorithm.
Yes.
It teaches the managers not to think, but
Yes.
not to pay attention to anything except the equation,
Exactly.
and to fit themselves into that equation.
Exactly.
So it is a kind of the antithesis of everything you just described. Oh, and furthermore, it is so it also kind of strikes me that when we desituate, when we work in analogy, when we extract from situatedness, we extract from consequentiality,
Mm-hmm.
so therefore accountability,
Mm-hmm.
and any means of representing. I'm repeating things you've already said,
Mm-mm-mm.
but any means of representing human beings.
Yep.
So it kind of it depersonalizes, it dehumanizes, it privileges an abstraction over a lived experience.
Exactly.
Always, over a lived experience.
Exactly. And to push on that, a few of your points, when you have the Excel spreadsheet, theoretically, and these folks know how to use it, I do not, but these folks knew how to use Excel, right? They could have gone in and they could muck about, right? Theoretically, people could muck about in Excel, like things are added into, it's a thing that you can muck about with. When you have a graphical user interface, like none of the stuff that I designed could have possibly been mucked about, right? Unless you had the kind of, for sure, somebody with the coding knowledge, they could have gone in there. I'm trying to be very generous here. I'm trying to be super generous, but not the manager who knows Excel. It's just not, there's not even the possibility of things being added or taken away when the interface is so defined as mine became. Yeah. And then the second piece was I proposed because I was very interested in the idea of prospect and refuge. So this bird's eye view, right, and then being able to look at the details. One of the things I wanted to be able to do is look at the decisions of managers made over time. Does one manager make the same kind of decision over and over again? What kind of part of the equation, what thing do they tend to privilege over something else? Do they have any fluctuation? Right? Is there some pattern? And there was no way. In fact, after I think 6 months of debating this, we found out that the system, as it was being coded, would not hold the previous calculation. They didn't design that. So every time you hit solve, it generated a new solution, and the previous one was gone. Which blew my mind, honestly, because I was like, but it's data. Don't you want to know how somebody is, don't you want to see if there's any patterns in what's happening? That would be so valuable, right? And that was not a possibility.
So it's not only against decisions, it's against developing the capacity to make decisions based on past experience. That's really interesting.
As it stood when I left it, that's where it was, right? But again, that was one of the reasons why, for me, the idea of the connection between the person, the manager, who was faceless, if you notice. In my first design, there was a person. I designed, almost it was like a Facebook kind of thing, right? Where you could see your little thing, and there was his name, and it was like, hey, I'm the manager, whatever. All of that went, like all of that got thrown out really quickly, and it only was the parameters and the one decision. So even the manager became lost in the process, abstracted into just what the calculation generated back. It's interesting, right? And one thing I will say, though, is I do have clear opinions about all of this. I don't think I can hide those. I don't actually think that that's what matters. I do think that knowing what you don't know is really valuable. So even if in the end you end up designing whatever, X, there's a lot that you can learn about what you're designing, about that, you know, whole bunch of territory, again, that you might have not considered if you look at it, the problem through these principles. Even if in the end you end up, you know, making a design that, you know, doesn't necessarily sort of, you know, can implement them, right? I think they should. I'm with you. I'm like, because I want to know all these things, right? And I would want people to know. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.